Chapter 10 of Early Days of Old Oregon by Katharine Berry Judson. Is in the public domain. Chapter 10 Adventures in the Yakima Valley. 2 years after Cox's horse race, the fur traders had another adventure which had to do with horses. On account of the War of 1812, the Americans had sold out their fur posts to the Canadian fur traders and went back to the States, either by land or water. Alexander Ross, however, signed a contract with the Northwest Company of Montreal, the Canadian company, and stayed in the Oregon country. It was 3 years now since he had had his adventure with the skunk, and he had learned a good deal about Oregon Indians and how to deal with them. This spring of 1815, the brigade of boats, having brought the furs down from the upper country to Astoria, or Fort George, were going up again. The name of the fort had been changed by the Northwest Company. They had their trading goods for the next year: pots and pans, knives and paint, guns and powder, blankets and calico, and dress goods. The Northwest Company had bought Fort Okanogan and Fort Spokane of the Americans, but they had trading posts of their own in what is now British Columbia. The packs of trading goods had to be taken north from Fort Okanogan by horses. When the traders that spring reached Okanogan, they found that there were not enough horses to carry their goods north again. It was a serious matter. Without horses, no trading goods could go to the Indians. Without goods, the Indians would sell no furs. Without furs, they would lose money in their business. Their whole business in that country was to secure furs. The leaders said, "We must buy more horses. Someone will have to go to the Yakima Valley." So he sent Alexander Ross. Ross was sent because he had been there once before to buy horses. Every year in the Yakima Valley, the Indians east of the Cascade Mountains held a great fair. Thousands and thousands of them trailed over the hills and over the brown, treeless plains of the Columbia to the grassy valley. It was not at all safe for a few white men to go among them at this time. This spring, 1815, it was really dangerous because the fur traders, in coming and going up and down the river, had quarreled with the Indians. White men and red had been killed on the upper Columbia. But danger or not, horses had to be bought. Ross started off with Tom McKay, a clerk, and with 2 French Canadians and their Indian wives. The women were to help in driving the horses. On the 4th night, as they rode southward from Okanogan toward the Yakima Valley, a friendly chief learned where they were going. He knew their danger, so he sent warriors to warn them. Too worried to sleep, Ross lay wide awake in his camp in the darkness. They all slept on the ground in the open air, with their feet to the fire. Ross knew they were all likely to lose their lives if they went on. Suddenly he heard faint rustling sounds near him, like someone creeping along the ground. Up he sprang in great alarm, shouting to his men. But at once, in low tones, Indian voices called out warningly, "White man! White man! Turn back! Turn back! You are all dead men!" They were the friendly warriors. That was startling. Ross knew then that the danger was greater than he had expected, that perhaps the Indians in the Yakima Valley were plotting directly against him. But he told the friendly Indians that the traders needed horses. He had to go on. They went back to their chief. The next morning, with a heavy heart, Ross started off again. 2 days later, the traders entered the Yakima Valley. The Indian fair at a distance was a very beautiful sight. Thousands of slender, graceful teepees were pitched in clusters in the broad sweep of the wide, grassy valley and along the river's bank. In all, the camp was about 6 miles square. 3,000 Indian warriors were there, besides the women and children. On the wide-spreading slopes, nibbling at the green grass and the bright wild flowers, were 10,000 horses. These tribes were all rich in horses. The Indians were having a glorious time in the bright May sunshine. In one place they were racing horses, yelling wildly. Others were racing on foot. In the teepees, or sitting on the warm ground in the bright sunshine, wrapped in their blankets, braves were gambling with dice and the gambling sticks. In some of the teepees, solemn councils were being held by the older warriors and chiefs. Feasts were being noisily eaten in others. Back from the mountains to the westward came hunters with fresh game, which the squaws cut up and cooked at once for feasts. In other places Indians were trading camas root and dried salmon, or swapping horses. Here and there squaws were scraping hides or cooking on the little fires which glimmered on the ground. And all through the camp Indians were singing, dancing, drumming on the tom-toms, yelling and whooping. This was the picture which Ross saw as he entered the valley. He wondered whether he would leave it alive. The traders spurred on their horses and rode toward the center of the camp, where they knew the greater chiefs would pitch their teepees. They seemed to see no one. But the Indians saw them, and followed them, with angry looks and words, as well as with hasty feet. The moment they reached the chiefs' teepees, the traders dismounted. At once, with yells and war whoops, the warriors seized their horses and drove them away. But even the chiefs were hostile. Referring to the quarrels on the upper Columbia, they said, "These are the men who kill our relations. These are the people who make us raise the death wail." Then Ross knew, as he tells us, that he stood on very slippery ground. Ross paid no attention to the words of the chief. He opened his trading goods, explaining that he wished to trade for horses. The jeering Indians at once drove up a horse. They traded it at a high price, took the trading goods, and then took the horse too. Ross showed neither anger nor fear. His men stood quietly by. They all knew their lives were at stake. The Indians brought up another horse. Ross traded for it quietly. The moment the price was paid, the Indians took the goods and the horse. So it went on. Every trade was made in the midst of wild uproar, in a circle of angry Indians who jeered and yelled, knowing, as they did, that the traders were entirely in their power. Horse after horse, bought and paid for, was driven away with whoops and laughter. For 2 days Ross stood in that one spot and traded for horses. The Indians were about, as much during the night as during the day. The traders could see the sunset, the darkness gradually fall, and the glow of the many campfires. Even the smell of cooking food came to them, yet they had neither light nor food nor rest. The Indians refused them any food. They dared not sleep. The danger grew greater. On the 3rd day, Ross heard the Indians planning to kill or make slaves of the 2 Indian women who were the wives of the French Canadians. There seemed no chance of escape, for throngs of Indians surrounded them in that great camp. Miles to the right of them, to the left of them, in front and behind, almost as far as the eye could see, even in that clear, bright air, were the tapering, slender Indian teepees. The only chance of saving the women was to send them by an unknown trail in the mountains to the westward, and then to the north. Yet even if they escaped, they might starve on the way. Ross gave them orders how to go, and told them to wait 4 days at the mouth of a certain river. If he did not come then, they were to return to Fort Okanogan and tell the traders there what had happened. There was little chance that the women would ever reach it. That night, as soon as it was dark, the 2 women, in their Indian dress, with blankets over their heads, slipped through the camp, up the wide Yakima Valley into the mountains. But the next day the Indians found they had escaped. They turned over all the parcels, searched every nook and corner, yet could not find them. The danger of the traders was greater than ever. The Indians tried to anger Ross's men. Their guns were snatched, fired off at their feet, and then, with wild laughter, the Indians threw the guns down. They snatched the hats off the men, put them on their own heads, and strutted about, mockingly. Then, jeering, flung them back at their owners. Ross was the chief, so they dared not yet touch him. The 4th day, half starved, Ross ordered his men to cook something for him and for themselves. All they had had to eat for these days had been a few raw roots. These they had pulled up out of the ground around them when for a moment the attention of the Indians was distracted. The French Canadians took out a kettle. The moment the kettle was on the fire, 5 or 6 Indian spears were thrust under the handle, the kettle pulled off, the water thrown out, and the kettle flung to one side. To give further warning, 30 or 40 Indians standing about fired into the glowing coals. A great cloud of ashes, smoke, sparks, and dust arose. It was a strong hint not to put the kettle on again. If Russ or his men had at any time shown fear or anger, they would not have lived more than a few hours. The Indians were deliberately trying to make them angry, because anger puts one at such a disadvantage. But so long as the men were perfectly cool, the Indians were almost afraid to touch them. One reason was that they feared the anger of the traders at the posts. They could not buy shot or powder or guns. Neither could they trade for anything else. And yet a moment's anger would have ended everything. At this moment the Canadian who had put the kettle on the fire took his knife out to cut off a piece of dried venison. A Yakima chief snatched it out of his hand. Ross's man lost his temper. He said in an angry voice, "I'll have my knife from that villain, life or death." "No," said Ross. The chief, noting how angry the man was, took a step forward. He threw back his blanket and raised his arm with the knife in his fist. The point was downward. He made a motion as if to stab the unlucky Canadian. That would settle things one way or another. The yells of the Indians ceased. They crowded around the four men. There was dead silence. The suspense was terrible as the chief stood there with hand raised to strike. The only thing to do, Ross thought, was to sell their lives as dearly as possible. He put his hand to his belt to pull out his pistol and moved a step forward. But even as he put down his foot, another thought flashed across him. Instead of his pistol, he drew out his own knife. "Here, my friend," he said quietly to the chief, "is a white chief's knife. I give it to you. That is not a chief's knife. Give it back to the man." The chief took Ross's knife and stood there sullenly. Ross said afterwards their lives hung by a thread. Every Indian watched Ross and the chief, silent, waiting for what would happen. Suddenly the chief handed to the Canadian his knife and held up Ross's knife to his people, much as a pleased child would. "Look, my friends," he said with delight. "Look at the chief's knife." The Indians crowded around him to see the knife. In his sudden joy the chief began to say that the white men were his friends. At once other chiefs began to say to their warriors that the white men were their friends. For the moment the danger was over. The chiefs at once called a council. They squatted on their heels in a half circle on the ground and began to smoke the pipe of peace. As the pipe passed from one chief to another, each taking a whiff, Ross gave to each of the 6 leading chiefs a small looking-glass with paper backing and cover and a little red paint. The chiefs, as a return gift, gave to Ross 2 horses and 12 beaver skins. But best of all, Indian women brought in food for the half-starved men. After the pipe had gone around once, Ross made a speech to the Indians. He asked them what he should tell the great white chief when he asked where the horses were. Ross said, "He will ask, 'Where are all the horses you bought from the Indians?'" The Indians were ashamed. "Tell him," a Yakima chief said at last, "that we have but one mouth and one word. All the horses you bought are yours. They shall be given to you." By this time it was sunset. Ross wanted to get his horses together and escape before the Indians became unfriendly again. And besides, every day of delay for the fur traders who were waiting for the horses meant a loss in trade. This last reason he gave to the chief. The Yakima at once mounted his horse, told Ross to mount one of those given as a present, and directed his son to take charge of Ross's men until he returned. They rode off. Such a night as that was! All through the hours of darkness Ross and the chief rode from one group of teepees to another, the Yakima calling out, "Deliver up the horses!" They visited every section of that great camp, spread for miles over the wide sweep of the green valley. Such a din and roar and crash of sound! Scalp dances here and there, with hideous yells as the dancers circled about the camp fire, the beating of tom-toms, the howling of wild Indian dogs, the grunting of chained bears. Chained wolves sent out their weird howls. Children were screaming. Women were scolding, horses were neighing and trampling about, thousands of them. And amidst all this din, up and down, in and out among the teepees, among the crowds who were whooping, yelling, dancing, drumming, rode Ross and the Yakima chief, calling out in the uproar, "Deliver up the horses!" If the braves were slow in bringing the horses, the chief would make a talk. At the end of each talk he would say to Ross, "I have spoken well in your favor." Ross would at once make him a present. At daylight, after all night and the noise and confusion, Ross and the chief returned with the horses. The men and the little trading property they had left were safe. By 6 o'clock the 85 horses they had bought were ready to be driven away. Ross ordered his men to make ready for leaving. But again the mood of the Indians changed. They made all the trouble they could. They jeered at the men, they frightened the horses, they seized the traders' guns and fired them off. They asked for everything they saw. While the men were trying to get off with the unruly horses, some of them wild and unbroken, the Indians took their knives, their belts, their hats, their pipes, and even demanded the buttons off their clothes. Finally Tom Mackay and the 2 French Canadians got away with the horses. Ross had to stay behind to parley with the chiefs. When he had at last got away, on an ugly, restive horse which kept trying to throw him, his men were far ahead. As he rode on, he saw 3 Indians coming at full speed on their horses toward him. Ross quickly dashed down a ravine, swam his horse across the stream at the bottom, and hid behind a rock while he primed his gun. He thought they were enemies. The moment the Indians got to the opposite bank of the stream, Ross motioned them to stay there, or he would fire. But the Indians called out, "Your friends! Your friends!" Sure enough, they were warriors sent out by that friendly chief who had warned him. He knew the hostility of that great camp, and he had sent his warriors to help the white men if they could. It took several days to reach Fort Okanogan. On their way they found the 2 Indian wives who had escaped through the mountains, and between them all they drove that unruly band of horses to the fort. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Early Days of Old Oregon by Katharine Berry Judson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11, Danger at Fort Walla Walla. "I shall build a trading fort near the forks of the Columbia," said Donald Mackenzie to the officers of the Northwest Company at Fort George, Astoria. "The forks are the most dangerous point on the Columbia River. I shall make the Indians see that we are friends, not enemies." By the forks of the Columbia, Mackenzie meant the point where the Snake River flows into the Columbia. This was in 1818, only 3 years after Alexander Ross had had his horse-buying adventure in the Yakima Valley. The Indians had said to Ross then, "These are the men who kill our relations," and there had been sharp little fights since then. The forks were not so very far below the Yakima Valley. So Donald Mackenzie began to plan for his fort. He was a big, powerful man, and the Indians admired him much because of his size. But they did not want a fort at the Columbia, and that was why Fort Walla Walla, Fort Nez Perces it was sometimes called, was a dangerous point. Mackenzie had only 95 men with him, and many of them could not be trusted. Some were Iroquois Indians from the eastern part of Canada along the St. Lawrence, some were Kanakas from the Sandwich Islands, a few were French-Canadian boatmen, only a half dozen or fewer were British. Alexander Ross was Mackenzie's first officer, and he tells the story. Half a mile north of the pretty little Walla Walla River and about 9 miles south of the Snake River, the brigade of boats from Fort George with 95 men drew up to land. Many Indians were encamped there. Now usually when the white men landed anywhere, the Indians went to meet them. But not this time. Not an Indian put out his hand to the white man. Not the least joy was shown, not even a request for tobacco. In their teepees of buffalo hides the red men stayed, or lounged about on the sandy ground. That meant trouble. Mackenzie paid no attention to this coldness. He ordered his own tent set up and the boats unloaded. The food and trading goods and guns had to be guarded, and a fort had to be built. Not a piece of wood was there at that point with which to build a fort. It was a dry, sandy, treeless spot. There was not a tree for miles. Far to the southeast lay the soft, shimmering blue mass of the Blue Mountains, and there were trees there. But that was a long way off. There were no bricks. There were not enough stones to build a fort, and even if there had been, they were not regular enough in size. There was no mortar or plaster to hold the stones together. Yet a fort was to be built on this dry, sandy point where they could not even have a garden. Mackenzie sent one band of men toward the Blue Mountains to cut down trees and float them down the smaller streams to the Columbia. He sent another band to catch driftwood from a bend in the Columbia just above them, a bend where the swirl of the current left driftwood on the bank or carried it close inshore. Another group of men guarded the property. The Indians still held aloof. The principal chief, instead of talking to the whites, paid no attention to them. He wrapped himself in his blanket and his dignity, and strode from camp to camp among his people, urging them not to trade with the white men. Other Indians came also, for the news was sent out by runners. Before long there were thousands of Indians who pitched their teepees along the Columbia near these few white men. It was a beautiful scene in spite of the danger. Fishes leaped in the sunny waters of the broad Columbia as it swept beside the camp. Horses grazed on the brown, treeless, rolling prairies around them. Indians raced horses on the plains, or swam in the river, or smoked among their teepees. Little columns of smoke curled upward in the still air, and tiny lights glimmered here and there in the twilight as the Indian women cooked for their families. At night, in groups, they gathered to hear some storyteller retell the myths and legends of the tribe. In daytime the children played about, almost naked, in the heat. Sometimes they ran to stare at the traders and said to each other, "What do these people want here? Are they going to kill more of our relatives?" Still more Indians paddled down the river in dugouts, or came over the brown, rolling hills on their horses. Then these thousands of Indians began to demand presents. They said the white men should not use their land for a fort. They should not take their driftwood out of the river, should not catch the Indians' fish, should not cut the trees of the Indians on the mountains. The Indians claimed ownership of everything. Too many trading goods would not have been safe until he had a fort built, so Ross had brought few with him. If he gave even a very small gift to each warrior, there would not be enough to go around. That would make even more trouble. When the Indians demanded gifts, therefore, Mackenzie said no. He said it was a good thing for the Indians to have a fort where they could trade at any time. Other Indians liked it, he told them. He would give them no presents. A few Indians had been selling them a little food. Now this stopped. Great councils were held. Mackenzie saw the danger and sent out for his scattered men. The Iroquois and the Kanakas and the French Canadians came down from the mountains and from the river banks where they had been securing wood. The baggage was piled up to form a hollow square. As the Indians one day suddenly became very threatening, Mackenzie ordered his men to stand on all sides of that square, with their backs to the baggage and each other. Their guns had been cleaned and were ready for use. Their knives were sharpened. If there was to be a fight, none of them could escape. But they thought that by being ready for battle and showing no fear, perhaps they could avoid an actual fight. The Indians around demanded gifts. Mackenzie refused. For 5 days and nights the men stood guard, alert every moment. No food could be bought, and the last night there was nothing to eat at all. They dared not leave the camp long enough to catch the fish leaping in the river. Without shade or shelter, in the blazing August sun, in that hot, sandy country, they kept watch. Despite the danger and the weariness of the hungry men, Mackenzie told the Indians he would give them no presents. They seemed so bold and so fearless, at last the Indians yielded. They told Mackenzie he might build his fort. They even brought food to the starving men and sold it to them. That ended the first danger. Still, the Indians might change again, might again demand gifts, and might attack them. Yet Mackenzie divided his men as before, sending some to the Blue Mountains, some to the Bend for driftwood, and kept a guard to protect the trading goods. When wood enough had been floated down the Columbia and the Walla Walla to build a fort, the men came in and began the actual work of erecting it. Because the Forks was such a dangerous place, Fort Walla Walla was the strongest of all the old Oregon trading posts. The fort was square, and the walls of very heavy slabs. These slabs, cut from the driftwood caught and the logs sent down from the rivers, were set in 2 rows. They were so set that each slab of one row protected the crack between any 2 slabs of the other, in this way. Picture. The walls were 20 feet high. On the inside of this stockade, 5 feet below the top, was built a narrow platform, running all around the walls, so that a guard, in case of danger, might patrol the walls and perhaps look over it. On each corner was built a blockhouse, 2 stories high, and thus higher than the walls. In the blockhouses, with their loopholes for guns and their supply of guns standing in the corners, were great tanks of water. The country was such a dry one, with gales of wind that swirled the dust and sand into great clouds, that the traders feared fire more than anything else. There were small cannon on the walls over the gate and in the blockhouses. Inside the stockade, a heavy wall of spiked logs divided the space into 2. In the inner section were the log cabins where the men lived, the blacksmith shop, and a few other small buildings. The Indian shop, where payments were made for the furs, was just on the inside of this spiked wall, with the narrow trading window, 18 inches square, cut through the wall. In this spiked wall were loopholes for guns. The main gate on the outer wall was a large one, but cut in that was a very small one, through which only one person could enter at a time. All this care was against treachery. If the large gate were opened, on ordinary occasions, perhaps many Indians might rush in and keep it open. So the small gate was used. But if, through treachery, they did break into the outer half of Fort Walla Walla, they found themselves in a pen, themselves shut in by walls through which muskets could be aimed at them, and with the blue sky overhead. When built, the arrangement of the fort was something like the outline shown below. This, however, does not show the log cabins inside the walls. Picture. But even after the fort was completed, the Indians, for many years, were not very friendly. They liked to annoy the traders, even if they did not often threaten them. An Indian would come to the small gate and knock. When Ross, or the man in charge, looked out of the little window which could be opened for that purpose, the Indian would say, "Give me a gun." But he had nothing to pay for it. "Give me some powder," another would say, and still another would demand, "Give me a knife." If the clerk in charge gave to one, he would have to give to all. The traders were there to buy and sell, not to make an endless number of presents. But if Ross refused, as he usually did, they became resentful. "Why are the white men so stingy?" they would say. "Get off our lands." Sometimes an Indian would come up and rap at the gate. When Ross answered, he would say, "I want to trade," and then jeer at Ross. He did not want to trade at all. He had no goods and only wanted to bother. These Indians were the Walla Wallas, the Cayuses, the Yakimas, and the Nez Perces, and others of eastern Washington and Oregon. They were the bold, daring horse Indians, and very different from the canoe Indians of the lower Columbia and of Puget Sound. They did nothing but hunt, gamble, race horses, or go to war, and afterwards have their scalp dances. Except when fighting or hunting, they were always idle. Ross could see them on every little knoll all day long, painting their faces with red and yellow and green and black. They seemed always to have a paintbrush in one hand and a looking-glass in the other. After a few years, however, the Indians of this section found that it really was a good thing to have a fur trading post on their lands. They found that these white men really were their friends. So they came to like the fort, although the traders always felt it was a fort with possibilities of grave danger. Many years later, in 1842, this wood fort burned down. The fire was accidental, and the Indians protected the trading goods and helped the traders to save everything they could. They felt very differently toward the fort and toward the white men than they had 20 years before. Still, they were Indians, and one never knew just what an Indian would do, as this gunpowder story shows. It occurred when they were building a new fort. You will remember there was no wood around Fort Walla Walla except driftwood in the Columbia. In order to get wood for paddles, the traders had to go to the Blue Mountains, 40 miles away, cut the trees, trim them, float the logs down the streams to the little Walla Walla River, and then haul them overland the few remaining miles to the fort. Many saddles were made at the fort, for the pack horses of the Fur Company went north from Fort Walla Walla, as well as eastward to the Snake River country and northeast to the Flatheads. Saddle wood, therefore, when dried and ready for use, was very valuable. One day the son of Peo Peo Mox Mox, the famous Walla Walla chief, walked into the saddler's shop and took some of the wood. The saddle maker forbade his doing so again. The next day the young Indian came back and took more. Archibald McKinley, who had charge of Fort Walla Walla, knew that this was going on. That day, when he saw the young Indian taking more saddle wood, he sent a clerk named Todd to stop him. Todd went toward the saddler's shop and entered. Before you could say "Jack Robinson," so McKinley said in telling the story afterwards, he saw Todd and the Indian plunge through the doorway, fighting. McKinley ran to separate them, but before he could reach them, Todd had thrown the Indian to the ground. McKinley demanded the Indian's name, for chief's son though he was not known at the fort. He was the son of Peo Peo Mox Mox, he said. At once McKinley knew there would be trouble. To knock down a chief's son! The new fort of adobe mud bricks was nearly finished, but there were yet no gates. All the men of the fort were in the fields 10 miles away. McKinley, Todd, and the saddler were the only white men there. An hour later, Peo Peo Mox Mox and his son, with 50 or 60 angry Indians, swarmed into the gateless walls of the fort and trooped into the dwelling, through the kitchen, into McKinley's room. McKinley, with great politeness, offered the chief a chair. Ignoring the chair, the chief sprang past him and caught Todd. He lifted his tomahawk high. McKinley caught his arm just in time to prevent his bringing it down on Todd's head. Peo Peo Mox Mox turned on McKinley, and the two chiefs, red and white, began to struggle. The other Indians let go of Todd and stood back, watching the leaders. McKinley, in the fight, managed to drag the chief toward his desk, where there were 3 pistols. Yet he was not sure that they were loaded. He caught them, tossed one to Todd, but ordered him not to fire without a command. Suddenly Peo Peo Mox Mox freed himself from McKinley's grasp and drew back. He opened his blanket, baring his chest. "Shoot me," he said scornfully. "You shoot a man." "I don't want to shoot you," said McKinley, "but if you raise that tomahawk again, I certainly will fire." Then they talked a while about the matter. The chief insisted that Todd must be thrashed. To do that, of course, would be a great disgrace in the eyes of the Indians, who looked upon the white men as superior beings. And, of course, the Hudson's Bay Company would have to send out of the country a man who was looked down upon by the Indians. While they talked, a young warrior struck McKinley. That was such an insult that McKinley caught him by the hair, intending to strike him. But that, he remembered, would be sure death for himself and Todd, would cause a war between the whites and the Indians, and make trouble that would last for years. There would be no chance of escape, for the room was crowded with Indians and only the 2 white men there. Suddenly a thought came to him. He sprang into the next room, seized a keg of gunpowder, and pulled it to the door. Wrenching off the top, he held over it a flint and steel, ready to strike. Flints and steels were used in olden times to make a spark before matches came into use. If he had struck, if a single spark had fallen into that keg of powder, well, anybody knows what would have happened. The Indians knew it certainly. In a twinkling there was not a redskin in the fort except old Peo Peo Mox Mox and his son. The rest fled, out through the kitchen, through the yard of the fort, and the gateless walls into the free space beyond. The chief stood still for a moment, and then he said scornfully, "Don't you think you are smart to frighten my young men so? I have heard that you white people fight duels. Now let's you and I fight." McKinley answered, and he himself tells the story, "There are only 6 white men at this fort and 600 of your people. Now, if you kill me, there is no other white chief to take my place. But if I kill you, there are plenty of warriors in your tribe who would make as good a chief as you are." The old chief went off at once, in great anger. A day or 2 later, another chief, 5 Crows, came into the fort. He had not heard of the trouble, so McKinley told him. He said, "It is a great disgrace for a chief's son to be thrashed. It will make trouble." Yet 5 Crows was friendly to the fur traders. After a few days of really hard trying, he made peace between Chief Peo peo mox mox and McKinley. The trader gave a suit of clothes to the chief. The chief gave the trader a fine horse. So they smoked the pipe of peace. When the missionaries came across the plains, beginning in 1834, and the immigrants years later, they found Fort Walla Walla friendly to them and very helpful after those long, hard months on the plains and in the mountains. They could buy there coffee and sugar and flour, as well as fresh fish and vegetables, things which they had gone without for weeks and months. Turkeys and chickens fluttered about the fort, pigs grunted in their pens, and cows, in the pasture not more than a mile or 2 away, gave fresh milk and made butter possible. There were rough bunks for beds, but that was better than the ground. Chairs made out of tree trunks were more comfortable than sitting on the ground. Food eaten from the table there was not full of the dust and sand of the desert, as it had been when they were in what is now Idaho, when the breeze blew dust into their food, while the hot sun poured down upon them. Later, the settlers came. Unless the immigrants were too many, there were often old bateaux, large open boats, which could be paddled down the river from Fort Walla Walla. Then the bedding and clothing and furniture were piled in great heaps in the open boats, people sat down on their baggage, and little children were tied fast to prevent their falling overboard. If too many people came at once, after settlement began, the immigrants had to follow the river trail to the Dalles. From there they could get boats while the cattle and horses and wagons went overland. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Early Days of Old Oregon by Katharine Berry Judson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12, Fort Vancouver and Dr. John McLoughlin. About 3 years after Donald Mackenzie, in the employ of the Northwest Company of Montreal, had built Fort Walla Walla, that company united with the Hudson's Bay Company. This English company was very famous. Its charter had been granted for 150 years, but all its trading had been in the country whose waters flowed into Hudson Bay. Now, by merging with the Northwest Company, they had a license to trade in the Oregon country. Many changes were made in the trading forts within the first few years. In 1824, the Hudson's Bay Company decided to abandon Fort Astoria at the mouth of the Columbia and build a central fort farther up the river. There were many reasons for this. One was that Astoria was too damp for the furs. In the damp coolness of the lower river also, farming was poor. Therefore, all the food supplies had to be sent from England. This was expensive. Another reason was that furs would keep better in the drier, sunnier climate at the new point. This new place, now the city of Vancouver on the Columbia, was nearer the upper country. The brigades would not have so far to come, and they would be nearer many Indian tribes who had many furs. Dr. John McLoughlin, 6 feet tall and more, blue-eyed, rosy-cheeked, white-haired, was sent to take charge of the fur trade of the Oregon country. He it was who decided to build the new fort, and he called it Fort Vancouver. Nearly a mile back from the river, on a broad, high prairie, they built the first Fort Vancouver. This was begun about December 1824. All the men were up there, and all the furs had been carried there by May 1825, although the fort was not completed. Fort Vancouver had no blockhouses, for the canoe Indians of the Columbia River were rather friendly to them. They were not so warlike as the Horse Indians, east of the Cascades. Still, there was danger in the earlier years of the fort. Not long after coming to the new fort, Dr. McLoughlin heard that many Indian councils were being held in the forests nearby. Many strange Indians appeared. If the Indians could get all those trading goods without bothering to trap beavers, so much the better. Beaver skins were used to pay for the goods. The white men were few, the Indians were countless. At once Dr. McLoughlin saw the danger. He sent out Indian runners, calling a council of the tribes with whom they traded. The chiefs came. Wild and savage, wrapped in their blankets, they entered the gates of the new fort and squatted on their heels, Indian fashion, in a large semicircle. After a while, in their slow way, they were ready for a council. But Dr. McLoughlin was not. He knew how to manage Indians. He wanted these great chiefs to understand that he was a very great chief, so he kept them waiting for him an hour. But as they waited, squatting in that circle in the fort yard, he sent out a Scotch trader who was also a bagpiper. Up and down the fort yard the Scot strode, with those wailing, squeaking bagpipes clapped under his arm, playing for those Indians. They watched that canny Scot with great admiration. The music of the pipes played by the bare-kneed piper charmed them. The great white chief had won. When Dr. McLoughlin came among them, they were only too ready to promise peace and friendship and furs. The Indians came as enemies. They went away as friends. This victory was not all due to the bagpipes. Dr. McLoughlin was a man of whom the Indians stood in awe. He was the White Eagle chief, because of his long white hair. He was very commanding in manner, and since he knew how to deal with Indians, he kept peace with them and kept them quiet. This made many furs for the fur trade. But also when American settlers first came into Oregon, it made it possible for them to take up farms without being murdered. Only at night at Fort Vancouver were the gates of the stockade shut. The Indians never did attack the fort. 4 years after the building of the first fort, it was abandoned. The new fort was at the same point, but nearer the river. All the furs coming from the brigade of boats, or from the Indians who came to bring them, had to be carried from the river to the fort. All the water used for washing or drinking or cooking had to be carried from the river to the fort. It was too far back, so the new fort was built just high enough to escape the floods. This second fort is the one which the Americans knew when they came in as settlers. The location was a beautiful one. Before them rolled the mighty Columbia, miles wide in the springtime, carrying down great trees, uprooted in the floods as though they were chips. All around were the dark forests on the rolling hills which bordered the Columbia. And above the blackness of the evergreens gleamed the shining white of the snow-capped mountains, Mount Hood being in full view. One of the nearby chiefs, named Casinove, though his name is spelled in many ways, liked to receive much attention from the white men. He was a great chief. He had many slaves and many wives, which showed that he was a rich man. When Casinove came to the fort to trade furs, he was paddled in his great war canoe by his slaves. He was received at the river bank with ceremony by the traders. As he walked the short distance to the fort, his slaves went ahead, putting down otter skins and beaver furs on the road so that the feet of the mighty chief might not touch the earth. After the furs were traded, and he was about to return to his canoe, the fur traders sent their servants ahead of this great one. They, in turn, covered the earth over which he walked with the blankets, woolen goods, calicoes, and clothing which he had bought. Perhaps it was a little hard on the furs and the blankets if the weather was not fine. The life of the traders at the fort was a busy one. The gardener was busy in his garden, among the vegetables or among the fruit trees, setting out new trees, pruning the old, and guarding them. Fruit was precious in those days. 8,000 miles of ocean and 2,000 miles of land lay between Fort Vancouver and the fruit trees of England or of the States. America was a long, long way from Oregon. The farmers plowed the plains near the fort. Rye and wheat and oats and peas and potatoes were sowed wherever the soil was good. Swinnards looked after the large droves of pigs. Herders tried to manage and tame the cattle which had been driven up from Mexican California, over the mountains and across the rivers, hundreds of miles to Fort Vancouver. Some of the best were sent by ship from London. Loggers were cutting down the trees so that more land might be cleared for the wheat and rye. The sawmills were busy sawing timber, which they sold in the Hawaiian Islands. In the fort itself, men were always busy. There were furs to be beaten and brushed to keep them from becoming moldy or eaten by insects. In the Indian shop, the trader stood at his little window and bought the furs the Indians brought in, paying in blankets and kettles and guns. Indians were coming and going, and the bright gleam of paddles from canoes crossing the river, or paddling up and down, flashed in the sunshine. There was even a baker there, with a great out-of-doors oven, who was busy baking bread as well as meats for the hungry men. Often there were 200 men busy at the fort and around it. There were two great events every year at Fort Vancouver. The first one was when the brigade of boats came down the river, the second when the home ship came in from England. The brigade of boats came down the river each summer in June to Fort Vancouver. It was the fleet of canoes which brought the furs down from the upper country. From far away in the north, on horseback, at a certain date, would start the men in charge of the fort farthest away. They came to the next fort, where more men and furs joined them. So down they came, through what is now British Columbia, to the fort farthest north on the Columbia River. Here they left the horses and stacked the furs in the canoes. On they paddled, singing cheerily, to the next fort, and so on down, picking up furs and men all the way to Fort Vancouver. Fort Walla Walla was the last fort on the southern part of the journey, and from there down they stopped only at night. The brigade came down when the river was high, in the bright June sunshine. After a year of loneliness, of cold, of danger, sometimes of hunger, in their northern post among the Indians, the light-hearted French Canadians were very happy. At each post they came in singing, dressed gaily in their best. Fort Vancouver knew just when to expect the brigade of boats. The watchman was on the alert. "The brigade! The brigade!" he would shout as his eye caught the first glimpse of the canoes on the river, just a line of tiny dark specks. And from white-haired Dr. McLoughlin to the little half-Indian children playing about in the fields, everyone rushed to the river bank. Down the broad blue river swept the canoes, sometimes 20 abreast, and in perfect line, led by the single canoe of the officer in charge. The Union Jack of Great Britain floated from the officer's masthead. It was on a scarlet background, and at the bottom of it, in white, was a half-monogram H.B.C. The boatmen were dressed in their finest, hats almost covered with feathers or with bunches of bright ribbons, and their beaded Indian pouches dangling from their gay sashes. Brightly colored handkerchiefs were knotted about their throats. It was a beautiful sight as well as a striking one, the broad green plains around the fort, the charming green islands in the river, the dark blackish forests coming down to the water's edge. Over them rose the snowy peaks of Mount Hood. The river sparkled and gleamed in the June sunlight as the gay fleet of canoes came down with fluttering flags and plumes and ribbons. The dark-skinned, black-eyed boatmen sang together some gay boating song, and sang in time to the dip of the paddles. Nearer and nearer they came, louder and louder was the chorus of song, while the men on shore shouted their welcome. Then the canoes, still in perfect order, still out in the middle of the blue river, wheeled in perfect line and came, side by side, in towards the river bank. Once there, with a shout, the men sprang to the shore. The danger and loneliness of the year was past. For 2 or 3 weeks there would be no hunger, no danger, no loneliness, no work. These voyageurs had a good time lounging about the fort during those few weeks. Busy officers sorted over the furs, counted them, and had them made into bales. Workmen dusted and beat out the new furs just brought in. From the storehouse they took the beads and knives, the blankets and guns, the powder and bullets and kettles, as well as the rice and flour and pork which were to go back to the upper country. But the dark, handsome, wild-looking men, dressed still in all their gay finery, played while those others worked. When the brigade of boats went out, every one was on the river bank again. The cannon at the fort fired a salute, the men's rifles fired an answering one. All was ready. Gay still in their holiday clothes, the voyageurs stepped into the canoes and took their places. Their passengers took theirs. The officers and the men going home to Canada, or Scotland, or England, were all passengers, for they went up the river, over the Canadian Rockies, and sailed from Hudson's Bay. At a pistol shot, every paddle touched the water at the same instant, and they were off again. Out they swept into the river, singing in time to the dip of the paddles, wheeling in midstream in perfect order, off again for another year of danger and hard work. Up the broad, blue river in full chorus, ribbons fluttering and plumes waving, until one could see only small specks on the blue water, and hear only the faint sound of song. Such was their going. The second exciting time was later in the summer, when the home ship from England came in. On this ship came the letters and newspapers from England. Every one waited eagerly for it. From the time it left England until the ship reached the long line of foaming breakers at the mouth of the bar was 8 or 9 months. Once over the bar, the ship came to anchor at Baker's Bay and sent a longboat across the river to the log cabins still at Astoria. The company's men held this place, but now only for the convenience of the ocean-going ships. A boat was ready there, with Indian paddlers, and the mail came up the river in that way. If the wind was contrary, it would take a ship 1 or 2 or even 3 weeks to come from Astoria to Fort Vancouver. The children were on the alert for the postman who came in this canoe. The moment they saw the canoe, they shouted, "The packet! The packet!" From the boat sprang the officer with the mail, and up to the fort he went. Every one waited there for the mail. Dr. McLoughlin shook hands with him, and with a wave of the hand sent him where? To the kitchen. He had been on the ship for months with salt meat and ship's hard bread, and the kitchen, with all the good things the cook had ready for him, there was the best place. But the letters! Every man dropped his work and crowded to the office, where the white-haired, blue-eyed Dr. McLoughlin sorted them over. The doors were full of eager men crowding each other. The windows were full of heads, twisted this way and that to make out an address. When sorted, the mail was handed out. All was silent as each man read his letters. But at dinner that night, such a hubbub! Each man was busy telling his neighbour all the news in his letter, for many of these men came from the same neighbourhood in Scotland. Their families knew each other. The dinner table at Fort Vancouver was hardly what one would expect in a fur-trading fort in the wilderness. It was entirely different from any fort that the Americans ever had. At the head of the long table sat Dr. McLoughlin. On either side of him were his leading officers. The others sat in order of rank and importance down the table on each side. The meals were good, with venison or beef, vegetables of all kinds, and with fruits. The servants were all men. The dinner was served in courses, and usually the higher officers wore evening dress. These officers were nearly all university graduates. The fur trade of the Hudson Bay Company was a regular business, carefully managed under educated men. It was not managed like the American fur trade. After dinner, the officers and clerks gathered in the bachelors' hall, as they called their great smoking room. The walls were decorated with elks' heads and antlers. The chairs were made by the carpenter at the fort. There was a library of good books there, and new books were sent over from England every year. Indeed, nearly every fort, even in the far north, had its little traveling library, which was changed every year. In this great smoking room, after dinner, the men talked of Europe and what was happening there. They were always a year behind time. They wondered if war might have broken out. They talked of books and authors, of gardening, and of the fur trade. They talked of all kinds of interesting things, while the great fire roared in the open fireplace and the room became blue with tobacco smoke. Candles were the only lights in those days, and when good nights were said, each man took his candle and the fire was covered. There were no white women at the fort. No man knew when he might be sent inland to some post among the Indians, and the life of a fur trader was too hard for a white woman. The wives of the officers were part Indian, but they were quiet, ladylike women, often very beautiful, and dressing like white women. They often warned their husbands of some Indian plot. This is the way Fort Vancouver looked when Captain Wilkes, of an American exploring expedition, visited it in 1841. Inside the stockaded walls were 4 acres of ground, and within these wooden walls were nearly 40 buildings, including a great bake oven. Outside the walls were the kitchen gardens. Beyond were broad fields of wheat, barley, oats, and peas, with large 2-story buildings where the wheat was stored. Once nearly all of that had been covered with trees. The Hudson's Bay Company had worked hard. Under patches of trees grazed large herds of cattle and flocks of sheep. Pigs grunted around their pens, and turkeys gobbled from the trees or from under them. Wild geese were on the river, and elk and deer in the forest. There were sawmills for cutting lumber to be sold at the Sandwich Islands. There were dairies where butter and cheese were made and shipped to the Russians in Alaska. There were large orchards of apples and plums and pears, besides other fruit. Dr. McLoughlin was always very kind to the Americans, and in later years became a naturalized citizen. When the immigrants began to come into the Oregon country, he did all in his power to aid them. He lent them cattle to draw their plows in breaking up the tough crust of the new earth. The crust was formed of matted roots and grass, and was very difficult to plow. He even lent them the plows, besides seed wheat and other grains, clothing to wear, and lumber to build their cabins. He prevented the Indians from attacking them. One day Dr. McLoughlin stood on the river bank anxiously awaiting some of the immigrants who were coming down in boats from the Dalles. It was late in the autumn. Cold had set in the upper country. He knew the poor wanderers were nearly starved and almost naked. He was so anxious he had come down to the river bank to watch for them. The Indians were watching too. As Dr. McLoughlin stood on the river bank, he heard an Indian near by say, "It would be good for us to kill these white dogs." Quick as a flash, the doctor rushed toward the Indian. He knew the remark had been made to test him. He upraised his cane as though to strike him. "What is that you say?" he thundered. The Indian began to shake at the anger of this White Eagle chief. "That is what the Dalles Indians said," he answered. "The Dalles Indians are dogs," said Dr. McLoughlin. Then he made the Indian understand that white men stand by each other, whether they were King George men, Englishmen, or were Boston men, Americans. But for the generous kindness of Dr. McLoughlin, King of the Columbia, as some white men called him, and the shelter and aid he gave to the Americans, whether missionaries like Whitman or immigrants who came to settle, there would have been much suffering from starvation, from exposure, and from Indians. Many of his letters, which have never been published, show how kindly he felt toward the Americans, and how truly he tried to help them. But it is not true, as his own letters show, that the Hudson's Bay Company were angry with him for the help he gave the Americans, or that he gave up his work because of that. The greatest help he gave the Americans was in his control of the Indians, so that the country was settled before the Indians began to attack the Americans. Attacks came only after the boundary was settled, and the Indians knew the country belonged to the Boston men. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Early Days of Old Oregon by Katharine Berry Judson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13, The First Apple in the Oregon Country. No captain knew when he started from London to Fort Vancouver on the Columbia River whether he would be wrecked in rounding the Horn, or be caught in some fearful storm in the South Seas, or even whether at the entrance of the Columbia his ship might not be drawn by the swirl of the current or some adverse wind on the bar. It was a long, dangerous voyage. So before the yearly ship left London, a dinner was often given to the captain. "Captain," said a lady at a dinner given to Captain Simpson in London, "when you reach that wilderness on the northwest coast of America, "Plant these apple seeds." And then, half in fun, she gave him the seeds she had just taken out of an apple. This was probably about 1825 or 1826. The captain said he would surely plant them. Then he put them in his pocket and forgot all about them. The next day he started off on that long voyage of 7 or 8 months. He sailed around the Horn, up the western side of South America and of North America, crossed the terrible bar of the Columbia with its thundering white-capped waves, and sailed up to Fort Vancouver. Then he sat in his dress suit at the right hand of Dr. McLoughlin at another dinner. But this time it was in that wilderness on the northwest coast of America. Putting his hand into his pocket for something, the captain felt the apple seeds. He took them out and told Dr. McLoughlin how they came to be there. At that time there were no apple trees at all at Fort Vancouver, and those seeds suddenly became very important. They were given to Bruce the gardener without delay. It took 4 grown men to plant those precious seeds: Dr. McLoughlin, Captain Simpson, Mr. Pambrun, and Bruce. First they were put in small boxes, in good earth, with glass over them. The boxes were put in the storeroom where no one would find them or touch them. The green sprouts, later, were planted in the fort garden by Bruce and carefully protected. The white-haired Dr. McLoughlin also watched over them. This powerful man, who controlled thousands of Indians and governed a country 800 miles long, north and south, and nearly 1,000 miles east and west, this king of the Columbia bent down with great interest over these tiny green apple shoots. He hoped they would bear fruit, and they did. "Now come and see. We are going to have some apples," he said to Mr. Harvey one day. Harvey himself tells this story, and he was afterwards the doctor's son-in-law. They went to the tree. One little green apple was hanging there. When it was ripe, it was picked and cut into many slices, for everyone had to have a bit of it. That first apple was a green one, but the next year there were more apples, and they were red. And the seeds of every apple were saved, planted, and tended, so that they became valuable apple trees. When the missionaries came, several years after that first seed was planted, they found a charming apple orchard at Fort Vancouver, with many a tree covered in the spring with beautiful, fragrant pink blossoms, and in the fall with red apples. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Early Days of Old Oregon by Katharine Berry Judson. This LibriVox is in the public domain. Chapter 14, The Adventures of the Whitmans. Levez, levez! Arise, arise! That was the French-Canadian call early one summer morning out on the Great Plains, and it awakened an entire camp. It was only 4 o'clock, and the sun was just rising out of the prairie grass, but the camp arose. They had to arise. For one thing, they had to be on the march. For another, no one could sleep through such a racket, mules braying and trampling about and men shouting to each other. And this happened every morning to every camp crossing the plains. In this camp there were 2 different parties, traveling together for safety. One was a missionary party with Dr. Marcus Whitman and his wife, Mr. Spaulding and his wife, and Mr. Gray, a carpenter, who was with them. The other was a fur trading party of the American Fur Company, who were going to the Rocky Mountains to trade beads and paints and kettles, guns and powder and bullets, and many other things, with the Indians for furs. The fur traders were used to this wild way of living, but the missionaries were not. They had lived always in small villages or in the larger towns. It was a new thing, especially for the 2 ladies, to spend week after week on the long, rolling, grassy prairies. It was not an easy life, even on the prairies. Farther on it was harder, because they had to cross the bare, brown, treeless plains, and then the mountains. After the guide called, and while the mules and horses made such an uproar, and camp keepers and muleteers shouted at each other, everyone dressed quickly. Then came breakfast. In the missionary party, Mrs. Whitman cooked it, while the men collected their own horses and milked their own cows. There was little to cook: coffee and buffalo meat. Bread was baked along the road beside an open camp fire whenever they could get a chance. For tablecloth they used a rubber cloth. Plates and cups were of tin, forks were of iron. They sat on the ground. Among the fur traders things were rougher yet. Then the day's journey began. Many a day on the prairies there was nothing but the long rumble of the wagon and the thud of the horses' feet. The hot sun poured down upon them, but nothing at all happened from sunrise to sunset. Sometimes they had adventures. One day the caravan of traders and missionaries was jogging slowly onward. There were 7 wagons heavily loaded. There were 400 animals, including horses, mules, and cows. There were about 75 people. Suddenly, as they passed a fold in the hills near Independence Rock, they startled a herd of buffalo feeding there. Out came the leaders, mad with fear, followed by the whole herd. The caravan was strung out nearly 2 miles long, and it was directly in the path of the buffalo when they stampeded. Everyone saw the danger. Every guard and every man not driving a team turned his horse toward the buffalo and dashed straight toward the foremost of the great frightened herd pouring out of the hills. Yet on the buffaloes came, heading straight for the caravan. If the herd kept right on, they would crash straight through the caravan. Mules and wagons would be overturned, drivers and riders and missionaries would be crushed under that mad rush. The only way to turn them aside was to shoot at them. Every gun was aimed at the oncoming buffaloes. Bullets flew among them like hail, but still they plunged forward. Horses and mules snorted with fright, tried to break their harness and to escape from the control of their drivers. Still onward came the herd of black buffaloes. Plunging and bellowing, with their big shaggy heads down, with eyes red, they rushed directly at the caravan. A continual shower of bullets flew among them. Just as they reached that long, strung-out caravan, the leaders, frightened by the hail of bullets, turned to one side. But they were so close that the guards who were firing found themselves forced back, right among the wagons. Yielding to that shower of bullets, which stung even their thick, shaggy hides, the black herd turned just in time to save the caravan from destruction and the travelers from death. The terrible stream of maddened animals swept alongside the caravan into the open plains. They grunted and groaned as they thundered along, making the earth tremble with the tramp of their countless hoofs. The caravan was saved. American fur traders at that time seldom went beyond the Rocky Mountains. These missionaries were going 1,000 miles beyond, into the Oregon country. As it was not safe for them to travel alone, soon after they left the American fur traders, they joined the British, a small party from the Hudson's Bay Company. This company, you will remember, had its forts all through the Oregon country and at Fort Vancouver, ruled by Dr. John McLaughlin. The officers of this company were always very kind to American missionaries. Soon after leaving the Rocky Mountains, they had to cross a land with no trees and few streams. The heat of the summer sun was terrible. When they stopped for luncheon, the missionaries fastened a blanket to the tops of 4 sticks stuck in the ground or across sagebrush so that they might have a little shelter from the sun. Their first stopping point, after joining the party of the Hudson's Bay Company, was at Fort Hall, about 40 miles from where Fort Hall City is today. The Whitmans and Spauldings reached Fort Hall after days of fearful heat. The fort was a small one, but the welcome given them was cordial. Trees grew along the banks of the little stream, which rippled and chattered over its rocky bed. There were bunks to sleep in and chairs in which to sit. The trader in charge gave them fresh bread and fish, with vegetables and cheese and butter. They had been without such food for many weeks. The very worst of the journey lay ahead of them, the officer told them. That seemed rather hard after the long weeks and months, first on the wave-like prairies and then on the flat, treeless plains. But ahead of them lay a rocky, sandy country. The rocks were both large and small, with sharp edges which cut shoes or moccasins like a knife. It was so dreary that no game lived in it. An American said afterwards that it was a land where men had songs for supper. The food had usually given out when they reached there, and they could not buy or catch or shoot any. Through this country the trail was a mere track through sagebrush and wormwood as high as the backs of the horses. Dr. Whitman wondered about the 2 wagons he had with him. The officer told him, with entire honesty, that it would be impossible to take the wagons with him. Every officer of the Hudson's Bay Company would have said the same thing. In their private letters to each other they said it was impossible to get a wagon through from Fort Hall to Oregon. But Dr. Whitman thought he could see what he could do. Mrs. Spaulding was ill, and he felt he had to have a wagon for her. He took off the wagon beds and made a 2-wheeled cart. On this he packed such goods as he could, yet then there was no room for either of the ladies. There was nothing else to do, so they went on horseback. So off went the Whitman party to the next fort, Fort Boise, Dr. Whitman himself taking care of that cart. He had a terrible time with it, in the struggle to get it through on that rocky, rough road, so overgrown with tall sagebrush and wormwood. His wife, again and again, urged him to let it go. The doctor would come into camp hours after the others had reached it, and tell them how many times it had been overturned. When they reached Fort Boise, the doctor did leave it behind him. From this fort, a few years later, the old cart was driven through to Fort Walla Walla by an old mountain man with his Indian wife and children, but he had such a time with it that he wished many a time he had never undertaken to do it. Yet the driving of that cart through to Fort Walla Walla, hard as it was, proved that it could be done. It proved that it was possible to get wagons through from the States to the Columbia River, and this opened the way for the later immigrants, who brought with them their wives and children, and could not have come without wagons. It was 6 years, however, after the Whitmans went to Oregon, before American wives and children began to go to the Oregon country with the men. But while the missionaries were struggling with their cart on the road to Fort Boise, and resting there, some Indians to the west were making some very interesting plans. The Nez Perces Indians, always a friendly tribe, heard that 2 white women were crossing the plains and the mountains. Now these Nez Perces, many years before, had heard from other Indians, and especially from Iroquois Indians of eastern Canada, of a great power who lived up in the sky. He was simply a mysterious one. They knew nothing of a God who is endless love. The Indians thought if they could find out about this great power, so they could talk to him, that things would go better. They thought there would be no more sickness in their teepees, that hunting would be more successful, that the winters would not be so cold, and they would have more blankets. They heard that the white people could talk directly to this great power. Therefore the Nez Perces wanted to have white teachers come among them. They had even sent to St. Louis, across the plains, asking for teachers. Now this tribe of Indians heard that missionaries were coming, and 2 ladies with them. Part of the tribe remained near their own grounds, but part went forward to welcome the white people. Can you imagine an Indian welcome? This is what it was. When within a day's march of the Spaulding camp, the Indians, and some fur traders who were with them, halted. The women smoothed out their long black hair and braided it, tying it with bright ribbons bought from traders. Their buckskin dresses were beautifully beaded, fringed with tiny hawk's bells and tinkling shells. Their moccasins and leggings were bright with beads. The warriors also combed out their long black locks and braided them, leaving a scalp lock free as a sign of bravery. They stuck eagle feathers in it, and sometimes a bright bit of ribbon. They put on their beaded buckskin shirts and leggings. The ponies were gay with blankets of red and blue. Some of them were painted yellow and blue. Their beautifully beaded saddle blankets were edged with long fringe, which swept the ground. Guns were all newly cleaned. The drummers took their tom-toms, the Indian rawhide drums. All was ready. When the scouts, looking over a low hill, saw the missionary caravan in sight with the fur traders, the signal was given. The gay Indians rushed to their horses. Then away they went, spurring their ponies, riding with mad speed, yelling, whooping, shouting, they dashed forward with wild motions. War drums crashed. Guns banged. Every warrior whooped like a demon. On they dashed, faster and faster, yelling louder and louder. Bang! 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 went the guns. When they had almost reached the missionaries, they suddenly pulled up their ponies and stood perfectly still. It was a trick for which the ponies had been trained. This was the welcome of the Indian Reception Committee. But the missionaries! Fluttering bits of white at the ends of the guns told the traders the story at once. They only took care the horses were not stampeded. There was no time to tell the missionaries, who thought it was a band of hostile Indians coming down upon them. They started to drive their cows and horses to a safe place among the wagons, caught up their guns, and made ready for defense. But when Dr. Whitman understood it, he thought it was great fun and was as delighted as a boy. The Indians wanted to see the white women. One of the squaws touched their skin softly to see if the white was paint. Then she kissed her new white friends. Mrs. Whitman was blue-eyed and golden-haired. Mrs. Spaulding was slighter, dark-haired, and very gentle. The cows and calves came in for many questions. The Indians thought they were tame buffalo. And what a welcome did the traders give these ladies! Well, one of them had not seen a white woman in 9 years. These white traders lived in the wilderness, just like the Indians. Then the whole throng, missionaries, Indians, American trappers, and British traders, rode on over the rough, stony country and through the mountains. The British traders and the missionaries went to Fort Walla Walla, which was in the Nez Perce country. But at Fort Walla Walla the horses of the missionaries would not even ride up to the gate. Turkeys gobbled around the fort yard, geese quacked, and hens cackled. That was too much for horses, which had been for months on the plains. Every kindness was shown the missionaries at the fort. Wooden bunks fastened on the walls, the rough wood bottom covered with Indian blankets, chairs, rough axe-hewn slabs cut from trees in the Blue Mountains, tables made from hewn slabs again, such were the furnishings at the fort. But they were offered with a kindness which was genuine, and it was much better than camping out of doors. Fresh salmon, bread, butter, tea, potatoes, melons, and vegetables of all kinds were offered to the guests. Indian runners had told the fort they were coming, so when they wanted to go farther, boats were ready, with the boatmen, to take them down the river to Fort Vancouver. It took 2 or 3 days to go down the river, riding smoothly over the broad blue water in daytime, and camping at night on the shore or on some island in midstream. On the river bank, when they reached Fort Vancouver, stood Dr. McLoughlin to welcome them, the same kindly, genial, White Eagle chief whom many white men loved. The good doctor turned some of the younger clerks out of their own rooms so that the missionaries might have them. They sat at that long table in the great dining hall at the fort, waited upon with men servants, with the dinners served in courses. Good dinners they were, with game, no roast beef yet, because cows were too few, and fish, with cabbages, peas, onions, beans, radishes, beets, potatoes, with puddings, and with fruits from Bruce's carefully tended garden, apples and peaches and prunes. Dr. McLoughlin took them out to see that orchard, the only one west of the Mississippi River. He was proud of it. He took them all over the farm, with hundreds of acres of peas, barley, oats, and wheat. In the small ponds cattle waded, or leisurely ate the grass in the fields, while in the great dairies, both at Fort Vancouver and on the island in the river, Multnomah Island, busy women made cheese and butter. When Dr. and Mrs. Whitman wandered about the beautiful big farm, swans preened their feathers or sailed about in stately way, while ducks quacked in the ponds. Bands of horses roamed about, feeding on the grass. It was just like coming home to the missionaries, with all those chickens and geese and ducks, with the horses and cows and apple trees. Yet this was still the unknown northwest coast of America, and Americans knew very, very little about it. Dr. McLoughlin did not wish the Americans to go far from the fort. A single murder by the Indians would stir up the entire country in Indian warfare. It was far too dangerous. He invited them to stay at the fort as long as they would. At last it was decided that the two ladies would stay there for a time, while their husbands and Gray the carpenter should build log cabins for their mission work among the Nez Perces Indians near Fort Walla Walla. They called it Wailapatu, meaning the place of ryegrass. The ladies were busy while they waited at the fort. Dr. McLoughlin had started a school for the boys around the fort to teach them how to read, how to write, and how to farm. Mrs. Whitman helped in the school, and she taught these children how to sing. The Whitmans were not the very first missionaries in the Oregon country. Jason Lee and his nephew Daniel Lee had come 2 years before and had settled in the Willamette Valley. But there were no women in that mission until later, and they came out from New York around the Horn by ship. 11 years after the Whitmans came, in 1847, the Indians began to be very angry because many settlers were coming into their country. Thousands of immigrants were crossing the plains every year now, and they had marked out that Great Medicine Road of the whites, as the Indians called the Oregon Trail. The year before, the treaty had been signed dividing Oregon between Great Britain and America. The Indians knew this. They liked the British fur traders, who did not build log cabins, did not farm, did not cut down trees and fence in the springs, did not drive away the wild game so that the red man starved. It was the Boston men, the Americans, who did these things. Therefore the Indians hated the Americans. Now things became worse. With the immigration of 1847 came much sickness. The trains of tired people stopped at the Whitman mission, and some of the sick were left there. Sickness spread into the camps of the Indians, and because they did not know what to do, many died. In the darkness and silence of the night, from lonely teepees along little streams, could one hear the death cry and the long wail of Indian women mourning for their dead. Still the sickness spread. The Indians said the Boston men were to blame for the sickness. They had brought it among the teepees so that the white man might have the lands of the red man. So angry they became that after long plotting they killed Mrs. Whitman and her husband and several other people who were living with them. All the others were captured and made prisoners. No one knew what to do. The Americans at the Willamette were helpless. If they sent an army of men, the Indians would kill all the prisoners or carry them into the upper country. If they sent only a few, since the Indians were on the warpath, they would not be strong enough to rescue the prisoners at Waiilapu. No one could help except the Hudson's Bay Company. Without even waiting to see what the Americans would do, Peter Skeen Ogden, a trader well known among the Indians up the river and trusted by them, started from Fort Vancouver for the mission. He took with him many blankets and kettles and paint, took things which the Indians liked. He traveled in such a way as to make the Indians think he knew nothing about the massacre. In one canoe with his voyageurs, he started up the river, stopping at the usual camping places, making presents, acting as though nothing had happened. They knew, of course. They did not know that he did. If Ogden had hurried, and the Indians thought he was afraid, he could have done nothing. When Ogden reached Fort Walla Walla, he called a council of the chiefs and demanded the freedom of the prisoners. The chiefs refused. It took days of time and many blankets before Ogden could persuade the Indians to give up their prisoners. The moment they did, he paid over the blankets and other presents, bundled the unhappy people into canoes, and started down the river as fast as they could go. So the poor prisoners were saved. But the Indians said, and the Americans also admitted, that no one could have saved these American prisoners except the Hudson's Bay Company because of their power with the Indians. And that power was based upon their rule of justice and firmness. After the prisoners were safe, the Americans sent a small army up the river. That is, they sent armed men, for they had no trained soldiers. Thus began the Yakima War. It lasted only a year, but many colonists were killed and the whole country upset by it. In the end, the Indians had to ask for peace. The 5 men who had murdered the Whitmans were hanged. And so ended the mission which had begun 11 years before, when Mrs. Whitman and her husband, with the Spauldings, had crossed the plains and the mountains to the Oregon country. Chapter 15. Chapter 15 of Early Days of Old Oregon by Katharine Berry Judson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15, The Oregon Trail. If a lively mule kicked off the coffee pot while you were crossing the Oregon Trail, where would you get another? From the Missouri River to Fort Hall, built in 1834, there was no place at which you could buy anything. Only Indians roamed the rolling prairies, the level plains, or the rugged mountains, and little could be traded from them except furs. It was quite the other way indeed, for Indians wanted kettles and pots. So great was this need that later Fort Laramie was built in the Rocky Mountains, but although built as a trading post for immigrants, its supplies were limited and its prices sky high. Before Fort Hall was built, there was no stopping place between the Missouri River and Fort Walla Walla. Look at the map on the next page and see how long a trail that was, and how many opportunities for loss in crossing the rivers and creeks and climbing the rugged mountains. At first, no one went to Oregon, and so there really was no Oregon Trail. There was only the trail for the fur traders and trappers who went to the Rocky Mountains with their trading goods and came back with the packs of furs. Immigrants of later years, going to the Columbia River, followed that same old fur trading route, and so it came to be called the Oregon Trail. At first, only men and boys went on the fur trade trail with their traps and their trading goods. They used pack horses or mules only, no wagons. Meat was supplied by the buffalo and deer on the plains, but each camp carried its own coffee, sugar, bacon, flour, and perhaps a few books. Each camp carried also its own tin plates and cups, its own iron forks and spoons, its own frying pans and coffee pots. So if that lively mule kicked off his pack in what is now eastern Colorado, perhaps, and lost the bread pan or the coffee pot, there was trouble indeed for the traders. Sometimes these trappers and traders had exciting adventures. Captain William Sublette, with a party of 60 trappers, was surprised one morning on the Kansas prairies by a band of Comanche Indians. He says there were 1,000 of them. Mounted on their racing Indian ponies, painted for war, fully armed with guns, which they were waving in the air, they came sweeping down on the little band of white men. 60 whites against hundreds of Indians. As these whooping Indians came nearer, Captain Sublette told his men to make ready to fire, but not to shoot until he did. The men raised their guns and stood waiting. On swept the ponies, bringing the Indians nearer and nearer, still whooping and yelling and waving their guns, until they were within 300 feet of the white men. Sublette gave a quick glance at his own men. They were ready. He raised his gun, aimed it at a leading chief, and prepared to fire. Instantly that chief sprang off his pony and laid his gun on the ground. Sublette understood. He at once laid down his own gun, but his men kept theirs aimed, ready to shoot. The chief began to walk toward Sublette. Sublette at once advanced toward him. That meant a peace talk, but both Indians and whites watched closely to see that there was no treachery. To Sublette's surprise, this chief said that he and his warriors would go away if the white man would give them a present. That was the easiest way out of a bad scrape, Sublette thought, and he at once agreed. The presents were given, and the Indians rode away. Sublette never knew whether they admired his men for their coolness, or whether they were a little afraid to attack those 60 grim-looking, determined white trappers. At any rate, it was cheaper for the Indians not to fight, and much safer for the white men. The very first women to cross the plains, you will remember, were Mrs. Spaulding and Mrs. Whitman in 1836. After that went a few other women, also missionaries. Later, a few Indian women, with their American trapper husbands, such as the well-known Joe Meek, and their children, went from the Rocky Mountains into the Oregon country. The mountain fur trade was done for, they said. Nearly all the fur-bearing animals were killed off, especially the beaver. It was 1841 and 1842 before white women settlers began to cross the Oregon Trail to the Oregon country. When it was found that women could go to Oregon, whole families began to go, including little children and even the babies. They traveled in big, canvas-covered wagons called prairie schooners. The lines of white canvas wagon tops crossing the rolling green prairies made a pretty picture, much like the white sails of ships on the rolling green waves of the ocean. Inside each wagon was packed all the furniture, chairs, feather beds, bureaus, trunks, bundles of bedding and clothing, and perhaps even a stove. The mother, with the very little children, rode inside or up on the seat. The larger children raced with each other, picked wild flowers, and played with their dogs, for the family dogs went too. The fathers walked along the dusty trail, swinging the black ox-hide goad, driving the slow, clumsy oxen as they dragged the heavy wagons over that long, long trail. Creak, creak, creak. Over the grassy waves of the prairies and over the flatness of the bare, treeless plains, sometimes far from water, sometimes by the side of the muddy waters of the Platte with its shallow banks, on and on rolled the wagons. From Westport, now a part of Kansas City, the immigrants passed up the Platte River into that land where no trees were, a country where a man could hide behind nothing but his own shadow. Indians sometimes attacked the immigrants, but only to drive off the horses and steal what they could. These were usually called friendly Indians. In a real fight, hostile Indians circled round and round the caravan on their trained ponies. They shot from under the horse's neck, each man lying so low on his pony's back that he seemed to be a part of the little animal. Their yelling and whooping frightened not only the travelers, but the horses and mules. Snorting with fear, the animals would break loose. Then the Indians could easily drive them off. Sometimes, in such fights, men and women were killed, and the train of wagons had to stop long enough to bury the dead. At noon the travelers stopped only long enough for a quick luncheon. The oxen and horses were not unyoked. At night the wagons at sunset formed a great circle. To defeat Indian attacks, the whiffletree of each wagon was fastened with a strong chain to the back wheel of the wagon in front. Inside the circle were the horses, mules, and oxen. It would be hard for the Indians to break through that circle of chains and wagons. Supper was cooked by the mothers at the little fires which glimmered all around the circle on the ground. The great heavy iron frying pans, with their long iron handles, so heavy that one could lift them only with an effort, were taken out of the wagons. Bacon was fried, and perhaps the coarse flour and water with salt was mixed and fried in the bacon grease also, for bread. There was not a separate pot and pan for everything. In the museum of the Oregon Historical Association at Portland is a wooden trough which was used, on one long journey across the plains, as a bathtub for the baby, as a wash basin, as a chopping bowl. It was used for mixing bread dough, and sometimes food was packed away in it. After supper everyone was ready for play or for bed. There was nearly always a fiddler in the larger trains, and sometimes the older boys and girls, and young men and women, would dance on the grass. But the smaller children were glad enough to go to sleep. The older boys slept, as did the men, on the ground under the wagon. The mothers and the girls, with the wee little boys, slept in the wagon bed. The night air was cool and sweet. If boys or girls were awake in the night, they could look up at the stars shining in the quiet sky above them, and in the darkness and silence they could hear the howling of wolves or the jerky bark of coyotes. Storms came sometimes. It was not always pleasant weather. The rains poured down upon the canvas, leaking through wherever a child's hand touched it as the wagons jolted along, even as a canvas roof leaks now in the rain if one touches it. Sometimes high winds blew over tents, or even wagons, ripping the covering loose, and the immigrants would be drenched to the skin, their bedding and their blankets wet, their sugar all melted, and the flour spoiled. There were plenty of hardships. The howling of wolves at night frightened the horses, and often they broke loose. Wagons overturned in fording the rivers, or even in crossing the creeks if the banks were steep. Another danger came from prairie fires. When travelers saw at dawn the red glow of fire, at first mistaken for the sunrise, or when they saw the dark clouds of smoke far off toward the horizon on a clear day, they knew their danger. A prairie fire was sweeping toward them. At once they started a backfire. That is, they set fire to the grass close to them, stamping it out on one side so that it would not burn into their wagon train, and fanning it so that it would sweep toward the oncoming flames. Then on this burned stretch they drove their wagons and loose cattle. On came the prairie fire, from in front of them or from behind them, leaping and roaring. Flames sprang high and black smoke rolled above those red tongues in the grass. But when it reached the backfire, it leaped high, fell, and died out. On the black earth left by the backfire there was nothing more to burn, so the fire would sweep by on either side of the travelers, yet leave them safe. If the fire burned the stretch ahead of them, the animals almost starved. There was no grass left to eat, no food at all for oxen and horses. And there might be no food for the travelers either, for the fires drove away the buffalo, the deer, and even rabbits and smaller animals. An artist named Catlin was traveling over the prairies in early days with 2 or 3 friends and an Indian guide. They wanted to follow a trail to a certain hill, lying blue in the distance. Since the day was fine, they set off in high spirits. The prairie grass, however, was very dry and very high. It was so high that the men had to stand in their stirrups to see well over it, and it was filled with the wild pea vine, in which the horses were likely to entangle their feet. After they had started, Red Thunder, the guide, got off his horse and laid himself flat on the ground, with his face in the dirt. The white men laughed at him a little, saying that he was making medicine. But when he arose, Red Thunder said, "Over this plain dwells always the spirit of fire. He rides in the cloud. The fire bow is in his hand." Red Thunder said that from the smell of the wind he was afraid that the fire spirit was awake. But the white men could not smell smoke. There was no sign of either fire or smoke anywhere on that wide sweeping plain, lying so green and beautiful in the glorious sunshine. So Red Thunder led the way as they went on, and they traveled until noonday. While the others were eating their luncheon, Red Thunder lay down again on the ground. He seemed to be listening. Then he arose, and his black eyes looked closely all around the horizon. Suddenly he cried, "White man, see that small cloud? The fire spirit is awake." In a second all had jumped upon their ponies. Then away over the trail they raced toward the blue hill, which still seemed so far away. Soon the horses could smell the smoke of the distant fire, and faster they sped. The wind was blowing hard now, and the fire could be seen. Then they could hear it, the terrible roaring like a great waterfall. Past them fled the wild animals of the prairies, fleeing like themselves from the terrible fire spirit. The white men dared not look behind them. The heavens were black and the smoke suffocating. At last Red Thunder reached the bluff toward which they had been racing. He gave a yell as his pony struggled up on the bare earth where there was no grass to burn. The other horses, too, with a last exhausted effort, sprang up the hill. As Catlin looked down, he saw, only a few feet below him, a sea of living fire. There was a fearful roar, and the red flames swept past. Then clouds of dark, acrid smoke rose from the plain. That, too, passed on. Instead of the rolling green of the beautiful prairie, there lay below them only a smoking, black, desolate plain. And the glorious sunshine, the blue sky, and the soft, white, fleecy clouds above made it only the more dreary. A great many emigrants did not see a prairie fire. But through the many months of travel, as the slow oxen plodded on, the sun was hot, the trail dusty, horses and oxen wore out and had to be left behind to the chance of starvation or wolves. Men, women, and children died from sickness and exhaustion. All along the Oregon Trail were graves. You could have followed the broad, winding road over the prairies and plains by the whitened bones of the animals which had died by the side of it, and by the many wooden crosses which marked the grave of some human being. The Indians called that road, worn bare of grass by the thousands of wagons which went over it through the years, the Great Medicine Road of the whites. They were used only to the narrow trails of their own people, and that wide road, worn so white and so bare, was a great wonder to them. As the immigrants neared the mountains, they threw away everything they could to lighten the load as the weary oxen pulled it up the steep, rough mountain road. They even shortened the wagon beds to reduce the weight. Necessary articles were thrown out. Bureaus with clothing in them, trunks filled with clothing, wagons were abandoned. At the campfires the weary people forgot their frying pans and coffee pots, and many other things. The smaller articles were picked up by the Indians, for anything which had belonged to the white men was big medicine. They sometimes took these things to the priests who were living here and there among them, to ask the use of them. One Indian bored a hole in a broken teacup and put it around his neck. It was his medicine, a mysterious something which would give him power. Bump, bump, bump. So after they had left the plains, the heavy wagons bumped through the mountains in what is now Wyoming and Idaho. When Fort Hall was reached, some of the wagons had to be left behind. Ahead of them lay that hungry land, where no game lived and nothing grew, that land where men had songs for supper. And through this land it was wise to take as few things as possible. For 400 miles after leaving Fort Hall, the trail was rough and rocky, high with sagebrush and wormwood. Wheels would come off and axles break. So, as far as possible, everything was packed on the backs of mules and horses. Old, worn-out horses and oxen were left there, after being traded for fresh animals. The fort people fed the tired beasts, rested them, and later on sold them again to other immigrants. There were lively times at Fort Hall in those days when an immigrant train was about to start off with the new pack animals. Many of them were not used to carrying packs. Oxen would bellow and mules bray and kick, while the air was full of flying pots and pans and kettles. Even as Fort Hall had helped the Whitmans when they passed through it in 1836, so the officers helped the immigrants of later years. But it was not an easy task. The fort belonged to a British company, the Hudson's Bay Company. So when the officers told the immigrants of the hardships ahead and advised them to go to California, which was really an easier route, the Americans thought it was because the British were trying to keep the country. This was not true. The officers wrote back to London just exactly the same reports that they made to the Americans. They actually thought it wild in the Americans to try to get through with their wagons and children. Besides, so many Americans came in later years that there were not supplies enough at the fort to provide for all of them. The Americans grumbled about that. But if the British had not been kindly, they would not have helped them at all. After the travelers left the fort, there was no game, little water, rough roads, hot sun, dust, cut rocks, sagebrush, broken wagons, worn-out people, on and on over the Blue Mountains with their steep sides, and through the Grande Ronde to Fort Walla Walla. But there were also Indians, and the fort warned the travelers against them. After one party had passed Fort Hall and was traveling along the Snake River, a band of Indians, black heads bobbing about in the water, swam across to their side. They ran on foot toward them, shouting, "Stop! Stop!" These immigrants had been warned by the British at the fort. Knowing they were thieves, they drove on, and drove rapidly. Then the Indians dodged in and out of the tall sagebrush, as high as the horses' backs, and began to shoot. The frightened women and children huddled down in the boxes of the wagons, while the men whipped up the horses and mules. Seeing that, the Indians ran along the river bank, under a bluff, to stop the wagons at the foot of a hill. The drivers dashed on. Such a ride as that was! Down the long hill they plunged, without brakes, the wagons bouncing from this side to that, striking against small stones, and almost throwing the children out. Down that hill they tore, and up the next one, expecting every moment that the Indians would appear, shoot again, or in some way stop them. That night, as they drove rapidly on, they caught up with another party which had been just ahead of them, so the two groups camped together. They built fires for cooking, and the mothers began to get supper. The men unharnessed the horses and mules and fed them as best they could. Then they smoked around the campfires, keeping the children in full view. They expected every moment, as they sat there in the light of the fire, to be shot at from the darkness around them. The next morning they did find Indian footprints in the sand near their camp. They had been followed, sure enough. But probably the Indians were afraid to attack the two parties together. When they came over the Blue Mountains and into the Grande Ronde, the Great Circle, as the French Canadians had called it, because it was a large and round valley, travelers had a hard time with their wagons. The mountain sides were so steep they had to tie a rope to the hind wheels of each wagon in going down. This rope they twisted around a tree, so that, as it was paid out, the heavy wagon moved slowly and could not so easily upset. Ropes used in this way cut a screw-like curve in the trees, and these may be seen even to this day. Even the pack horses had a hard time on the steep trails, setting their feet close together sometimes and sliding down. Every now and then someone had to stop to mend a broken axle or a broken harness. So the immigrants crawled up the steep mountain sides and almost crashed down them, fording rivers even where the current was quite swift and the water deep, until they were safely past the Grande Ronde. From there it was sand and sagebrush again until they reached Fort Walla Walla. Or perhaps, if they felt hostile to the British traders there, they would go to the Whitman mission and buy vegetables and melons and flour, for Dr. Whitman's mission farmed much land, and there were supplies which he sold to the travelers. Indians brought fish to them also, large salmon taken fresh from the water. One woman took off the big kitchen apron she wore and gave it in payment to an Indian for a large salmon. That was much better than money in Indian eyes. From Fort Walla Walla there were two ways of going down the river to Fort Vancouver. One was by water, if there were boats. The other was over a rough mountain trail, through bands of robber Indians, along the banks of the Columbia. Horses and cattle were always driven by the trail. In later years a road called Barlow's Road was cut through the forest south of Mount Hood. Then, instead of going to Fort Vancouver first, the cattle could be driven directly to the Willamette Valley, where in early years all the settlers were. For many years, however, the women and children went down the river in the boats of the Hudson's Bay Company, which were sent up to the Dalles to meet them. Other boats were used, or perhaps the trail to the Dalles. These boats were old and called bateaux. They were built for the fur trade and not for passengers. They had no decks at all. They were enormous rowboats, sometimes 40 feet long. Yet they were all that could be sent, and all that could be spared. There were no other boats in the country except the Indian canoes. Little children were tied to the masts so they would not fall overboard. Tired men and women sat down upon coils of rope, rolls of bedding, and bundles and packages of all kinds and shapes. They even slept upon them, curled up as best they could. So the travelers came down the Columbia River. Sometimes it was under a blue sky by day, with the river dancing and sparkling in the sunshine. Sometimes it was on a gray day, with a broad stretch of gray river all around them and a chill wind blowing. Sometimes, indeed, it was late in fall, and snow was falling, and the days and nights were cold, and there was no food. Very few immigrants had much clothing left after that 6 months of rough life across the plains, and they were sometimes chilled and half frozen. They came down the river to Fort Vancouver, where Dr. McLoughlin gave them a welcome. "I could not have done more for them if they had been my own brothers and sisters," he wrote in later years. He gave them food and clothing, waiting years for payment. He let them have cattle for plowing and seed grain, axes to cut down trees that they might build their log cabins. He trusted men to repay him when they could raise their crops, after their cabins were built and their families taken care of. He gave work to many men, buying the shingles which they split, buying the grain which they raised. He did all in his power to help them. Some of the Americans, many of them, did repay him. Others hated him because he was British, and let their debts go unpaid. So this is how the early settlers came into the old Oregon country. They settled first in the Willamette Valley. Later they came into what is now Washington, and built their log cabins around Puget Sound. End of Chapter 15.